Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem.
This is Peah, chapter 5, Halacha 4. Don't forget that when the Torah commands the leket, the shkikaka, and the Peah, it's commanding it when you do the harvest. It's from your land and from when it's your harvest, okay? So the Mishnah is going to start and say, if a householder is traveling from place to place, and he needs to take leket, shkikaka, peah, or Maaser Ani for himself, he may take it, and when he returns to his home, he shall pay what he took. These are the words of Rabbi Eliezer. The sages say he was poor at the time when he took the portions of the poor, and therefore he does not have to pay upon returning home. So the term householder is referring to someone who generally is too rich to be allowed to take leket, shkikaka, and peah, or even Maaser Ani. The Mishnah is talking about someone who is traveling. He runs out of food and money on the way, and currently he lacks resources. So now he's allowed to take the portions intended for the poor. The Vilna Gaon says that it stipulates that this permit pertains only if the person is unable to borrow money. So this person is really, really out of it. So the question's going to be is, okay, well, now he's over in this other place. He's out of everything. And yeah, maybe he has lots of money back at home, but he can't even borrow money. And he has no food. So is he allowed to take the leket or not? Is he allowed to take the gifts from the poor or not? What's the point of the sages? The sages are arguing that although the traveling householder has the adequate assets back home, since he currently lacks the resources with which to buy food, he is considered authentically poor. And hence, upon returning home, his status is like an absolutely poor person who later became wealthy. And the Rambam points out in Hilchos Matanos Aniyim, chapter 9, Halacha 15, that such a person has no obligation whatsoever to repay the gifts that he took when he was poor. So the sages are holding that there's no reason for the householder to repay the gifts, even as an act of virtue. So that's a big hiddush. So really what the sages are saying is they're saying that it's very nice that you're rich on your balance sheet. It's very nice that you're rich back home, but right now you're so poor that you can't even eat. You got a big problem. So the Mishnah now is going to talk about a law pertaining to the exemption of leket, shkikaka, and peah from tithes. So we were talking about this before, sort of, and the Mishnah reads like this. So the Mishnah in Halacha 4 says, if one exchanges his own ordinary tevel produce with the leket, shkikaka, or peah produce of the poor, the law is as follows. With respect to the produce that is now his, he is exempt from tithes, but with respect to that which now is the property of the poor, he is liable to tithes. So we know that leket, shkikaka, and peah are inherently exempt from tithes. That comes up in Trumos, in Yerushalmi Trumos, chapter 1, Halacha 3, in Maasros, chapter 1, Halacha 1, and in Chala, chapter 1, Halacha 3. That's everywhere. Not only that, where are these sources deriving it? They're deriving it from the Torah itself. This is Doraita that they're exempt from tithes. And it remains so even if the rich person gets it. In other words, if it becomes the rich person's property, they're still exempt from tithes. And he may actually consume them without separating Truma and Maaser. This is the special status of leket, shkikaka, and peah, that they're always exempt from tithes. They don't have kedusha, but they're exempt from tithes. So in this other case where, with respect to that which is now the property of the poor, he is liable to tithes. So perhaps there's an exchange, and for whatever reason, the poor person trades with the rich person ears of grain, and the poor person has genuine leket and gives it to the rich person. The rich person can eat it without tithes, but the poor person has to tithe it. We know that tevel produce that the poor person receives from the owner remains subject to tithing, even though they receive it in exchange for leket, shkichacha, and peah. So the Mishnah now is going to discuss a prohibition against a poor person taking the portions of his own produce that are designated for the poor. So there's a prohibition in the verse in Leviticus 23:22. It says, "You shall not eliminate the corner, the peah of your field as you reap, and the leket of your reaping you shall not gather. For the poor person and the convert you shall leave them." And this juxtaposition of these two verses, lo teleket and la'ani, leads these words to be expounded as a single phrase, and it says that means you shall not gather to the poor. So this is understood as teaching that even a poor person who is permitted to take peah and leket from other fields is commanded not to gather the peah leket of his own field. He must leave them for other poor people to take. And this prohibition is extended to shchicha through a hekesh, and also Maaser Ani through a gezerah shava. That gezerah shava, by the way, you can find in the Bavli and Hulin 131b. But generally, it's a rule that you can't take your own stuff. If you're leaving gifts for the poor, you have to separate it for another poor person. If you're a kohen and you're separating out gifts, you have to give it to another kohen. You can't just take it for yourself. You got to give it to someone else. So that's a general rule in the Torah that's going to come up here. So there's going to be a little complexity because the case is going to come up of, well, what is sharecropping? Okay, so if you have two poor people, they leased a field as sharecroppers. Notice that they leased it. They don't have some sort of ownership in the field. They leased it. This one may give that one his share of Maaser Ani, and that one may give this one his share of Maaser Ani. In other words, you have this sharecropping arrangement under which a worker, he's going to contract to cultivate and harvest someone else's field in return for a fixed portion of the yield, maybe like a half or a third or a quarter. And more than just being a salaried worker, the sharecropper is considered to actually own an interest in the field and the produce until he receives his promised share. And in the Mishnah's case, two poor people are arranging with a farmer to cultivate the field as a sharecropper, and the sharecroppers are partners in the field and its produce. And the prohibition against an owner taking the leket, shchicha, peah, and Maaser Ani of his own field, even when he is poor, still applies to him. So he can't make a sharecropping arrangement where he doesn't own it. He has some arrangement where he gets a portion of the harvest, and then he's going to take out, if he's poor, the leket, the shchicha, and the peah for himself. He can't do that. But what he can do, in this case, you have two poor people. They're leasing a field as sharecroppers, says the Mishnah, and you can exchange the gifts for the poor with the person over there, and that person over there gives it to you. That's also the case, by the way, in the Halacha for Maaser today, for Maaser money today. If you have two poor people with Maaser money today, the Shulchan Aruch says that you can exchange, that this person can give to that person can give to this person. So it's the same idea as what's talked about here for Maaser Ani. So in this case, where that one may give to this one, the Maaser Ani, each of the poor sharecroppers may give his fellow the Maaser Ani, and then he separates his portion of the produce. And this is because each sharecropper is considered an owner of only his portion of the crop, not his fellow's portion. So, yeah, this guy over here, he leased it, and he's working for, a quarter of the produce over here, and this one over there is working, maybe even on the same field, for a quarter of the produce over there. But because they don't actually have ownership of it, and they're only getting it after the harvesting, he's allowed to exchange a portion of his crop. So while each of them is not allowed to keep the Maaser Ani himself, that he separates from his own portion, there's no restriction from receiving the Maaser Ani of his fellow's portion. And this leniency is applicable only to Maaser Ani, which is designated after the produce is divided. That's the key point. It has to already be divided. In other words, you have to know the amount, that 25% that you're getting, has to already be designated. You can't take it out before it's designated. That's a really key point. And there's other problems where it doesn't get designated yet in Baba Metzia in chapter 2, where there's problems with the crop, trying to do things with the crop where it's not yet designated. You have to designate. Be like, this portion is your crop, Mr. Between the farmer, between the owner of the land and the guy harvesting it. So in other words, you can't just take the grain piled up and guesstimate it out and then do it. It actually has to go through this thing where it's clear and it's released between both parties, between the person who harvested it and the person who is the owner of the land. And after that, then you can separate tithes. But before that, you're not allowed to yet. So that's the key idea, is that the Maaser Ani is designated after the produce is divided, and each sharecropper is the sole owner at that point of the produce that he receives from his share. That's the point. Okay, this is now a clean pile where this is definitely the property of that sharecropper. Leket, shiurim, and Peah are designated before the crop is divided. That's a big difference between Maaser Ani and leket, shiurim, and Peah. One is before the crop is divided. The other is when it's after. And when the sharecroppers are partners in the entire crop, all the leket, the shiurim, and the Peah of the field is prohibited to both sharecroppers. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, in his Shiurim in Seif 108, says that if, however, each sharecropper is designated a specific half of the field to cultivate, in return for a percentage of that half's yield, then each of them would be permitted to take the leket, the shiurim, and the Peah of his fellow's section of the field. In other words, if, like what Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is pointing out, you made a sharecropping arrangement where, I have this half over here and I get 25% of the produce on this half, and you, the listener, you have 50% of the field over there, and it's clearly defined where that field is, and you get 25% of what you harvest from that field over there. Then we both can leave leket, Peah, shiurim, and we can exchange it. You can take mine from over here, and I can take yours from over there. And that occurs before everything gets sorted out and designated with the landowner. In other words, only the Maaser Ani has to be designated after. And that's to release the ownership of that pile so that he's the sole owner. But let's continue on the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, if one leases a field for the purpose of harvesting it, he is forbidden to take its leket, shchicha, peah, and Maaser Ani. Rabbi Yehuda said, when is this law so? When he leased the field from the owner for a share, such as a half, a third, or a quarter of the produce. But if the owner said to him, a third of what you harvest shall be yours, he is permitted to take the field's leket, shchicha, and peah, but forbidden to take the Maaser Ani. So this is one of those cases where, depending how you phrase the business deal, it's going to change the terms a lot. And there's a lot of there's in Shvius in chapter 4. There's a list of some of the most obscure halachas that are in all of the Torah. And all of them have to do with these differences of phrasing business terms, business ownership terms, like this. So we're going to unpack that. So when it's saying that if one leases a field for the purpose of harvesting it, this is going to refer to a case in which the sharecropper contracts only to harvest the field in exchange for a share of the crop. And that's not the normal sharecropping agreement in which he contracts to work the land the entire season from sowing to harvesting. So this is where he's only coming to do the harvesting, not the planting or tending to the crops or anything else. This is an unusual way that farming is contracted out in Judaism or in history. It's not normally done this way. Somebody has to plant the crops. Somebody has to take out the weeds, right? It's very unusual that this is being done this way. So the Shara Emuna says that about this idea that he's forbidden to take the leket, the shchicha, the peah, the Maaser Ani. Shara Emuna says that although in this case the produce grew in the sole possession of the owner, and the worker acquired his sharecropping interest only when he began harvesting the field, he is nevertheless forbidden to take its leket, shchicha, peah, or Maaser Ani, since he gained ownership rights to the field and its produce while the produce is still attached. The mitzvah to leave the gifts for the poor falls upon him as well. So he is consequently bound by the prohibition against the owner taking these gifts for himself, even though he's poor. So that's a key thing, that the way this is contracted and the way that this is phrased, he precludes himself from being able to collect the gifts. In other words, that he's gaining the ownership rights to the field and its produce while the produce is still attached. So he's, the mitzvah to leave these gifts to the poor, falls on him as well since it's attached. That's the main point. So Rabbi Yehuda says, when is this so? And whenever Rabbi Yehuda uses this term, when, he means to explain the Tana Kama's view. He's not disputing the Tana Kama's view. So that's a really deep insight about the way the Mishnah is written. So whenever you see Rabbi Yehuda saying that, he's basically being the mouthpiece for the Tana Kama's view. So basically you could read it like, what is the Tana Kama saying here? So when is this law? So when he leased the field from the owner for a share such as a half, a third, a quarter of the produce. So the Pnei Moshe says that in this case, the worker acquires a share in the field and its produce while the produce is still attached. And he is thus considered an owner at the time that the leket, the shchicha, and the peah obligation takes effect. And since he's counted as an owner, he's not technically poor enough to be able to collect it. So he's basically negotiated himself out and phrased himself out, used phrases in a way where he precluded himself from being able to acquire it. Now it says, but if the owner said to him, a third of what you harvest shall be yours, you see the difference, he is permitted to take it. So he's not allowed to take the Maaser Ani, but he's allowed to take the others. Now, the Gemara is going to clarify the difference between this case and that one, but you can see right away that this is different. And what's being introduced here that we haven't seen before is going to be the difference between the leket, shchicha, and the Peah, and then the difference between those and then the Maaser Ani, which comes after. And in that case, it's forbidden to take the Maaser Ani. The Gemara starts, and it says that it's going to be talking about these two sharecroppers that they can give Maaser Ani to each other. And it says, it was taught in a Baraisa, a father and a son, a man and his relative, two brothers or two partners, may all redeem Maaser Sheni for each other without adding the 1/5 surcharge. The Maaser Ani produce, by the way, must either be eaten in Jerusalem or redeemed with money, and that's taken to Jerusalem to purchase food that will be eaten over there. And a person who goes and redeems his own Maaser Ani has to add a 1/5 surcharge. That is Doraita. That's in Leviticus 27:31. That's what happens when you have this. You have to add this surcharge. One who redeems another person's Maaser Sheni money, though, does not need to add that 1/5 surcharge. The Baraisa is teaching here, says the Rosh Cirillo, that while a close relationship exists between the father and the son, or a man and his relative, they are nonetheless treated as two distinct individuals. And if one of them redeems the other's Maaser Sheni money, he does not need to add the 1/5 surcharge. We do not say that since they are close to each other and would presumably support each other, if the situation called for it, each one's redemption of the other's produce is tantamount to his redemption of the produce. That's the note by the Rosh Cirillo, and Rashi says something similar in Kedushin 32a. So Rabbi Yudan says a curse should befall one who gives his father Maaser Ani. They said to him, from where do you take it to curse him? Why do you, in other words, why do you not deny the halachic tradition that a father and a son may give each other Maaser Ani money, which implies that they may do so without, any compunction at all, without any problem. And Rabbi Yudah replied that a halachic tradition refers to a situation where both the father and the son are poor. So, in other words, since the son does not have the means to support his father from his own funds, it is acceptable to feed his father the Maaser Ani. And this curse is going to be applied to someone who has the means to support his father honorably, but he demeans the father by having him accept Maaser Ani money like a common poor person. So it's demeaning, says Rabbi Kanievsky in his Biur Shiurim, for a son to give, the father charity funds if they're not both poor. That's the point of this curse. So there's a caveat in there. The Mishnah now was talking about if somebody leases a field for the purpose of harvesting it, he is forbidden to take the leket, the shchicha, the peah, or the Maaser Ani. So that continues. And it says, the sugya says, Rabbi Yudah said, what is the law when he leased the field from the owner for a share, such as a half, a third, or quarter of the produce? But if the owner said to him, a third of what you harvest shall be yours, he is permitted to take the field's leket, shchicha, peah, but not allowed to take the Maaser Ani. And the Gemara answers a question that Rabbi Yudah asks, and what basically the Tanna Kama are saying in the Mishnah. Here's the Gemara's answer. It says, What difference is there between the later case where the owner said a third of what you harvest shall be yours, and the first case where the worker contracted to harvest the field for a third of the produce? What is the difference? The Vilna Gaon says this. Vilna Gaon says says in his commentary on it, says, in either case, the commitment to give the worker a share was made while the produce was still attached to the ground. Thus, the worker became an owner before the leket, the shchicha, and the peah obligation takes effect. Why should he be allowed to take them in the later case? So, because he effectively becomes an owner, he's got a problem. He's becomes effectively too rich to be able to take it for himself. The Gemara is answering and says, in the later case, the terms of the agreement mean when you harvest, a third of the produce will be yours. And the Rosh Cirillo points out that the stipulation, a third of what you harvest shall be yours, implies that the worker acquires a share of the produce only after it's harvested. But before that, and during the harvest, he has no interest in the field or its produce. And as such, the leket, the shchicha, and the peah obligations, with the prohibition against a poor person taking these gifts for himself, they only fall upon the field's owner and not on the worker. So if he phrases it the first way, where he leases it from the owner for a share, such as a third, where it's basically saying a third of what you harvest shall be yours. If he's phrasing it in the first case where the worker is contracting to harvest the field for a third of the produce, that's where it's still attached. But if he's harvesting it where it's phrased as when you harvest a third of the produce, it will be yours, then that's only taking a place after it's harvested. And that's the point. So it's not like he's getting ownership of something that's attached, and therefore he's only collecting the benefit after the fact. In the first case, he has a third of it. It just hasn't been harvested yet. He contracted to basically own a third of what's there, but it hasn't been harvested yet. His job is to harvest it. So the later case is, when you harvest it, a third will be yours. That means that triggers after that work is done and they separate it out. That's when he can collect it and he gets his ownership. And that's after the work is done. So he can collect, if he's poor, the leket, shchicha, and the peah. So that's the difference, and it shows you how careful you have to be in business transactions, because the halacha really does shift and it really does change, and you really might have more liability or less liability depending on how you phrase it. The Mishnah is the Mishnah where it was talking about if someone harvests half of the field and then he sells half with a standing grain, the buyer gives peah for the entire field, both his own harvest and the seller's harvest. So that was in chapter 2, Halacha 5. The Yerushalmi over there, was inquiring whether the seller, in the event that he's poor, may take the peah that the buyer leaves for the seller's half of the field. And do we say that since it is the buyer who designates the peah, he is the owner, and the seller is not restricted from taking it? Or do we say that since the peah was designated for the seller's produce, he is considered as the owner and he's forbidden to take it? So the Gemara is now going to get into this as the basis for Rabbi Yehuda's ruling in this Mishnah and in this Gemara. The Gemara says, Rabbi Hiya, the son of Rabbi Bun, said, this later ruling of Rabbi Yehuda, that when the landowner says a third of what you harvest shall be yours, the worker is permitted to take the peah of this field, even though some of it is designated for his share of the produce, says, in effect, that when a buyer designates peah from the seller's portion of the field, and the sugya continues, it says, the seller may acquire the peah that exempts his harvested sheaves from the peah obligation. So, let me just bring up a point by one of the Meforshim. Let's take a look at the Mara Fulda. Mara Fulda says, Rabbi Yuda's ruling demonstrates that when a landowner designates a portion of his field as peah for another person's share of the crop, in other words, the worker's share of the crop, and that person is not a partner in the land. Again, he's not a partner. He's only getting the benefit after it's harvested. That peah is deemed the designator's peah, and it's permitted to the other party. And it follows that when a buyer designates a section in half of the field as peah for the seller's produce, it is deemed the buyer's peah and permitted to the seller. So who no longer has any interest in the buyer's half of the land? So the point that Rabbi Hia is saying is he's saying that, when the buyer designates peah for the seller's portion of the field, the seller may acquire the peah that exempts the harvested sheaves. So this is talking about, again, before it's harvested and after it's harvested, who has ownership of this standing crop. Are you going to be getting ownership after it's cut, or did you technically get ownership of it while it's still attached to the ground? So Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Bun, is going to reject this, and he's going to say that over there in chapter 2, Halacha 5, the seller's half of the field became obligated in peah when it was still in his possession. In other words, says the Mara Fulda, to explain it, is saying that when he harvested its produce and the seller himself was subject to this obligation and prohibited, not allowed to take the peah. So regarding that case in chapter 2, we were inquiring whether the peah designated by another party is deemed to be the designator's peah and allowed to the seller, or the seller's peah and prohibited to him. So the Vilna Gaon says that although the seller transferred the burden of peah designation to the buyer, when the buyer designates a portion of the standing crop as peah for the seller's share, he satisfied the obligation that rested on the seller. And regarding this case, we inquired whether the prohibition against a poor person taking his own peah still pertains to the seller. So the Gemara continues, says, but here, in our Mishnah's case, we do not have a situation of the worker's field becoming obligated in peah when it is in his possession. In other words, says the Mara Fulda, to explain it, he says, the worker never owned the field. He never owned it. And he did not even own the produce until after the harvest. So the peah obligation falls entirely on the landowner, and when he designates peah, he does so to fulfill his own obligation. Rabbi Yuda's ruling that the worker can take it has no bearing on this question. So in the earlier case, in chapter 2, they were doing a transaction where the grain, if it was there, was still attached to the field, and you basically sold the field and the grain. Over here, so if you were trying to acquire the leket, the peah, the shchicha, even if you were poor, then you couldn't do it because you would be rich enough so that you wouldn't be able to acquire it. You'd be wealthy enough where you wouldn't be able to acquire it. So what would happen is because it's attached to the land. The land has value, has too much value for you to become poor or considered poor to be able to take the leket shchicha and the peah for yourself. You can't do it. Over here, these transactions are occurring where you made some sort of sharecropping arrangement, and this is what's new about it, right? This is a new type of sharecropping arrangement that hasn't been brought up yet in Peah, where you're only getting control over the crop after. You're only getting this crop after, and after it's been harvested, and after you sorted it out, like what it says in chapter 2 in Baba Metzia, where the owner recognizes it and you recognizes it, and you sign off, and you're like, okay, yep, we both agree that this is 25% of the harvested crop. Thank you very much. Let me take my pile out. It's after it's harvested, and now you can take the leket shchicha and the peah because you're still considered too poor. You don't own any of the land. So in the other case, the seller transfers the burden of peah to the buyer, but in that case there, the buyer had the crop attached to the land. So yeah, the buyer still has to take out peah, but he can't take the peah for himself. Rabbi, so we're just going to finish up this halacha. Rabbi Yudah stated in the Mishnah that when the owner tells the worker, quote, from this Mishnah, a third of what you harvest shall be yours, the worker is permitted to take the field's leket, shchicha, and peah, but not allowed to take the Maaser Ani. The Gemara now is going to explain why Maaser Ani is different from leket, shchicha, and peah, and how it's different. Rabbi Abahu bar Nagri says, it is different with respect to leket, shchicha, and peah, for the Torah commands that they are left for the poor when the field is harvested. That, by the way, is Doraita, says from your harvest. Leket, peah, shchicha is used in the Torah when it says your field and your harvest. So when you're harvesting it, that's the trigger for leket, shchicha, and peah. But Maaser Ani is different. That only takes effect after everything is harvested, and when the produce has been fully processed, and the worker then receives his share. So since the obligation to give Maaser Ani for this share falls on the worker, he cannot keep it for himself. And that's what the Rambam says in Hilchos Matanos Aniyim, chapter 6, Halacha 15. In other words, the point by the Rambam is that the Maaser Ani obligation takes effect after the harvest, when the produce has been fully processed, and by which time the worker has received his share. Obviously, has to receive his share, and the obligation to give the Maaser Ani for this share falls on the worker. And since he has to take out the Maaser Ani from his share, he's not allowed to keep it for himself. He falls into that same position, just like the Kohen who tries to separate Truma and Maaser. He's got to give it to another Kohen. That poor person who takes out the Maaser Ani can't keep it for himself. He's got to give it to another poor person. And it's that same rule applying. Over there, it would be for Truma and Maaser for a Kohen, and over here, it's going to be for Maaser Ani for per person. You can't keep it for yourself. You got to give it to someone else. That concludes chapter 5, Halacha 4. And really what it gives you a glimmer of is how careful you have to be when arranging your contracts, because the Halacha really does change. Thank you so much.